As we begin, let me just give this reminder that I won't be showing the main text that I'll be using today. That's going to be Exodus chapter 20. So those verses won't be on the slide, but the other times that we turn to other passages of Scripture, there are two today, I will put them on the screen. But the main one, Exodus chapter 20, I'd ask that you go ahead, if you're going to turn in your Bible, turn there now, and we'll be referring to that throughout the time together. Now, we're considering a theology of work. And in doing that, what we're asking is, well, what does the Bible have to say about work? And then again, how do I act in relation to that? How do I put that into practice? Last time we ended with the importance of work. The Bible says we're supposed to do it 6 days and 7. And then even on the seventh day, in addition to worship, we also rest. So we sort of recuperate. We refocus ourselves on what the next week will hold for us. And also, importantly, we think back on the previous work. And if we're doing things as God did, he looked on what he did and was able to say it was good, even very good. So what we want to be careful about is not to get the matter of work wrong, because it takes up so much of our life, even 24/7. So if we get that wrong, we're really wrong. So what are some principles that we can follow? Well, what we've looked at thus far is this, that work is a gift of God. God works, and so too should we. It even says in the Bible that he created man and put him in the garden there to dress and to keep it. That's work. In eternity, we looked there and saw that we'll be working as well. So in a perfect world, the perfect worlds of the past and the future, God has work for us to do. And the gospel accounts speak of Jesus as saying that in that present time, his time, he said, "My Father worketh to this very day, and I work." So we have the example of God, past, present, future. It all involves work. And he does his work well. He completes it, rests before the next job, and then gets back to what he does in his next avenue of work, knowing that what he has done, he's done well. And there's that sense of satisfaction in it. And even when the work is hard, when it's difficult, in fact, maybe the harder the job, the more complex and difficult it is, the greater our satisfaction is when we accomplish it and accomplish it well. So we have God at creation. It says of him there that the earth was without form and void. And then God got to work. 6 days later, he finished, said it was good, very good. That's our goal too, to be able to enjoy our labor and the results of it. So like God does, we should do. Work then is a gift from God, and we should be able to rejoice in it. I've commented more in the recent past to people who are in retirement or going into retirement. And knowing my audience, I'll address that again, that when it comes to work, just being in retirement doesn't mean that we stop working. It just means that you maybe have more choice in your work. There's perhaps less demands, or at least on the scheduling of it, but you're not to forego work. And I know, you're working harder now than you ever did before, right? Probably so. But that's as it should be. I mean, you had all that practice, so you should be the ones who do the most work and are the best at it. But that is a sort of segue into a funny thing that happened to me this little while ago. Let me hold this up. Can you see that there? Yeah, that's a notice from the Canada Pension Plan. It appears that next year I'll be eligible for retirement. When I got that, I took a picture of it and sent it off to Brent and said, hey, you can come up right now. Start next week. I'm retiring. He wrote back, you're going to be too busy keeping me out of trouble to retire. I really do like him. We get along together well, but if you tell him I said that, I will deny it. But the retirement for me is not something that I intend. It's certainly not something that the near future holds for me. I've mentioned before that I want to end up being that old doddering pastor who keeps repeating himself, who says embarrassing things, who rambles on, and generally is a pain. So I also married a woman who's much younger than me. Actually, that has nothing to do with it at all, but I do like to say that. But Tony, shout out to you. You've asked me in the past about getting together to talk about CPP. I guess maybe it's about time to do that. Time for maybe thinking about a second career too. I wonder if Walmart's going to need any greeters. I could be one of those people who count how many people are allowed into the store. Or maybe at Costco. No, that's just crazy there. But back to work. Work is a gift of God. The second principle is that work is governed by God's law. Now, while the Bible does not give us specifics on choosing work, it actually as well doesn't say much about how we're to do the actual job. There are laws that are given that apply to that situation. Many questions in life are answered by examining it in light of the law, and that's true too of work. So we have two statements of the law that will help us. The first is the Mosaic Law. That's 10 commandments governing work. And then there is the law of love, 2 commandments governing work. Those 10 commandments emphasize the moral aspect of work, not just legal. Just because a particular job might be legal wouldn't mean that it's necessarily moral. And the 2 laws speak of loving God and loving my neighbor, my fellow man. Now the 10, they're largely negative, though it is implied that if you're not doing this, thou shalt not, the implication is thou shalt. You should be doing this. So you shouldn't kill or do murder, but you should do the opposite, though it's not stated, and that is preserve life. But the 2, love your God and love your neighbor as yourself, they're entirely positive. So you can do that or should do that in every deed of life, including work. Again, then, while not perhaps much is said, the Bible does, in fact, in the little that it does say a lot. All right, so let's begin looking here at Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 7. Let's review by reading those verses. And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. All right, first we're going to look at this generally. Then I will apply it to the subject of work. And these verses emphasize several things. Notably, I'll put it this way, don't mishandle God. These verses speak obviously to the danger of worshiping idols. You can see that in verse 4. It speaks of a graven image. That's you put your hand to something and fashion it into something that is your God. And that's what people try to do. They try to put their hand to God and make him like they want him to be. The way they do this is they begin with this sort of question or a statement. If only I could have that. Or if only I could be like that person, have what they have, do what they do. So they begin with that. This is what they want. And then they fashion an idol that will let them, that they think will let them have what it is they want. So that which is their ultimate desire, they think that will bring them satisfaction. And so they'll serve that, whatever it is that they think will get them that thing. Now that's just idolatry. It's thinking that something in the creation will satisfy you more than the Creator. Here's the result, verse 5. You will bow down and serve it. Now, in your mind, you're serving or working for it, or rather to get it. That's the idea you have in your mind. Your thinking is that you will be the God of it, that you will own it, that it will serve you and give you pleasure. That's just not so. Instead, like in verse 2, the word bondage, you become a slave to it. That thing or that person, even that ideal, it has a hold of you. Now, here are the warnings that are given. Number 1, don't localize God. Don't try to reduce him to a location in the creation. And don't minimalize God. Don't try to reduce him to a part of the creation. Basically, it's this. If your God can be found in this world somewhere, I mean, that thing that you would look to and say, if I just had that, or could do that, or be that, I'd be happy. If you can state that thing and look somewhere and say, oh, look, there it is, it's over there. Like, oh, it's down in Egypt, verse 2. Or if it can be seen somewhere in the world, like there in verse 4. If it's something that's in this world that you can get your hands on, or you can go somewhere and find it in this world and say, look, now I've got it, I'm holding it, I possess it. If you take anything like that and put it up before God, is that for which you will serve because of what you think it will give to you, then you're worshiping an idol. Now, you might think that God's making too big a deal of this, but that's the second observation about these things, these verses, and that is that we need to be careful that we don't trivialize God. So don't think he's overstating things like there in verse 7 when he says it's such a big deal that you better not even take his name lightly. And there in verse 5, he says that he's jealous, that he gets angry about those who do these sorts of things. He says he looks, he sees what you're doing, and he says, wait a minute, you can't get away with that. He takes note, he doesn't let it go. It's personal to him. And that's in part because he is a personal God. If you despise him and you worship someone other than him or something other than him, well, it's personal because it's like, well, that you might be in a situation, say, where you would think or say to your spouse, look, you really ought to lighten up here. What's the big deal that the sort of relationship that I have with you, I'm going to have with someone else too, with another person? No, you don't lighten up about that. You take it seriously. That's the way God's looking at it. But it's also not only serious because of what it does to your relationship to God, but also there are consequences, ramifications for you doing this that affect not only you, but others as well. So that if you get this wrong, it's not just you that's affected by it. It's also others. And you can see that. It's evident there in verse 5 by the word iniquity. That's a plural noun. So what's happening here is that a whole bunch of sins are being lumped together, but though they are lumped together, there's a whole bunch of them in that reference. So that it's indicating that what's happening here is that idolatry is not the only sin. Things have moved beyond that to all sorts of other sins. That idolatry leads to other things. And this is exactly what the Apostle Paul is speaking to there in Romans chapter 1. Let's look at those verses. You can see there in verse 21 that it more or less mirrors what has been stated there in Exodus chapter 20. That here is a person who is not glorifying God, giving him the honor and the respect that he deserves, but instead, or there in verse 23, making idols of things that are found in the creation. Then, in verses 28 through 31, verse 28 picks up again and speaks of the idolatry, where men start doing things that are, the word it uses there is convenient. Word as it's translated, and it's the one Paul uses. It's not as innocent sounding as it seems in that word. The word means that it doesn't fit, it doesn't work. It won't go right. It won't go well for you. All right, if you start doing these sorts of things, it will turn out bad, real bad. And so he talks about idolatry, then verse 28 picks it up again, and he goes on to say what that will lead to in verses 29 through 31. These things people do that ruin their life and the lives of others. And like iniquities in Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, the sin of idolatry, it multiplies, it metastasizes, it pluralizes. So as you look there at verses 29 through 31, you see that getting wrong the first commandments that relate to God, that is, you commit idolatry against him, it leads to sin against others. And in those verses there in Romans, you see the breaking of the last 6 commandments of the 10. Those of man's responsibilities to other men. I mean, can you see the connection there? So you got verses 21 through 23. You fail to worship God and you start worshiping idols. That's resumed there in verse 28. Same idea. Here's the result. Verses 29 through 31. You start doing all sorts of things that are not convenient. Things that harm you and others. You break the rest of the 10 commandments. And the rest of those commandments are right there in those verses. Verse 49, fornication refers to all sexual sin, and that's under the statement, thou shalt not commit adultery. Covetousness, the 10 commandments, thou shalt not covet. And that, along with the other actions that are listed there, like unrighteous, full of envy, covenant breakers, those are all akin to the command, thou shalt not steal. Murder, well, that's easy, thou shalt not kill. And then deceit, whisperer, there in verse 30, goes along with backbiters. Literally this means to slander, an inventor of evil things. You make up harmful things against someone. All that relates to thou shalt not bear false witness. Then again, verse 30, disobedience to parents. Verse 31, without natural affection. That's all, honor thy father and thy mother. So if you violate the first table of the law, those first 4 commandments, you sin against God, that will lead to other multiple iniquities. You will be violating the second law of the commandments of 5 through 10. It's like the Apostle Paul says in James chapter 2 and verse 10, for whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. So we cannot compartmentalize God, nor our relationship to our fellow man. Sin is that pervasive. One sin leads to a plurality of sin. Iniquity is iniquities. And it all starts with putting something else before God. Go ahead and look back there again at Exodus chapter 20, verses 5 and 6, because the effect of sin is not just horizontal. Our sin does affect those around us. It's also generational. Our sin affects our children. Now, of course, they're around us, so it would be horizontal in that effect, but it's indicating here that our children learn from us and pass it on to the next generation, so that sin in our life can spread not only to affect those around us, but generationally those who follow us. Sin is that wide and that deep. Now, that's why God takes it so seriously. To fail to serve God automatically makes you an idolater. You will serve your God, but it will also cause great effect in all those around you. Bit of a summary then. Let me quote for you from Victor Hamilton. He's writing on the first table of the law, the Ten Commandments, and this is what he said. Two inexorable principles are illustrated here. One, every man takes on to some degree the character and nature of the God he worships. And two, the characteristic of all false gods is that they destroy their worshipers. Destroys their worshipers. Notice again, back there in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, sin leads you to bondage. Idolatry is the first sin that begins the trek down to Egypt. God is the one, it says, who will bring you out of that bondage. Now, he doesn't need your worship, though he does deserve it. You need to worship him, because the option to worship an idol, that's devastating, both to you and to those who are around you, and to those who come after you. Here's what we must do. Verse 5, don't do this. Don't serve idols. And don't, see it there as the next to last word, don't hate God. Instead, verse 6, love God. Keep his commandments. And it says, serve him. Now, that's the first 10, the 10 commandments. Do that. And in doing that, you're showing love to God. Well, that's the 2 commandments. Love God, love your fellow man. But first, like the first table of the commandments, love God. That's first. The result will be, if you're properly loving God, you'll love your neighbor. And that's the second. It follows naturally from the first, just as the opposite does. Fail in the first, hate God, don't worship him, you'll show a hatred toward your neighbor. So sum it up this way. Just 2 things that are contained there in the first commandments referring to God. Love God, serve God. Serve. Well, that sounds like work. So let's apply this to work. First, obviously, don't make work your God. While I am trying to get us to think more about our labor, it's a theology of work to which we're heading. So, the goal is not necessarily more work, though it might be in some cases. But overall, the goal is a better appreciation for the goal of work, a better work ethic, and a consideration of our work in relation to God and our fellow man. But if we make work, and that would include just thinking about making money, if that is our primary goal above all else, then work becomes idolatry. and we're in bondage. There will be ruin in our lives, and it will also not only affect our relationship to God, but it will also affect others as well. God's against that. So, how do we guard against this? Well, there is a key way right there in the context. It's the fourth commandment. And let me read beginning in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So while work is a priority, it's not an absolute. I do plan to return to this and develop a bit more fully after we go through the remainder of the commandments. But I just want to note here that though the Bible does not require Christians to keep the Sabbath as the people of Israel did, there certainly are principles that clearly carry over to us today. Namely, work precedes worship. I don't mean precedes as in prominence or more important. I mean that first we work, then we worship that day of rest. In fact, the only thing that is to interrupt our work is worship. And that should show us worship is, in that sense, more important or have precedence over work since it can interrupt it. Now, I do want to note that I concede that there may be times when labor is required instead of worship. The Lord Jesus himself indicated this in the gospel accounts, but it's not to be a regular practice. It should be an exceptional thing, that in the need to honor God, we would do this form of labor or work, or we would do something that would be of benefit to our fellow man. So, when we consider the reference there that's made in verse 11, it's speaking of God at creation. And the example that we have back there is that God rested on the seventh day, and he looked upon the work that he had done and said it was good, even very good. All right, that's the example for us. That there should be a time when we pause. We pause in our work to reflect on what was done in the previous 6 days. And we ought to be able to look as God did and say, that work I did in the previous 6 days was good, even very good. So let me challenge you in that respect. To follow the example of God, it would be appropriate for us on that day that we give to worship to spend some time looking back over our previous week of work and consider it. Consider it in light of the question, did I do good in that work week? Not did I make a lot of money, but did I serve in a way that honored God and brought benefit to my fellow man? Work is that important that a consideration of it should be a part of our worship. That we ought not to let weeks at a time go by without some reflection on what we did. Now that reflection is going to include the rest of the commandments that we'll look at, how we are to treat our fellow man. And in a sense, it's very helpful for us because when we take that time on that day of rest to consider our work that we did, what we find in those verses that we'll look at is a sort of a checklist. So we can deliberate as to how we spent that previous week. We can have a time of examination by looking at that checklist that we'll consider next. But the point here we were seeing is that work is too important to be left go unexamined. And in addition to work in relation to our fellow man, notice too that in this first table of the law, it says that we should examine our work in light of God. So how do we do that? Well, we have a hint for us there in verse 7. It reads, "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain." So in one sense, this means that we better not talk about God as if he's not there hearing us. In all of our work, God is there. If we use his name, it better be in a way that he would sanction a proper use of his name. But there's another way that this binds us to take his name, not in vain. And the idea is that in our actions, we take on his name in the sense that we are doing it as if it is in his name. Remember, we serve him. So the work that we do is at his behest. He is calling us to do it. So what we do, we should be able to claim it as something that he himself would sanction and has called us to do. That he would put his name to it. Be proud to own it. So we better make sure that what we do does that. That someone would look at it and be able to say, "You did that good," even very good. And to violate this, well, that would be sort of like someone who calls himself a Christian but doesn't act like one, or who acts in a way that's not consistent with that name. So it ought to be that God's name is not smeared by the work we do, whether that be the thing that we're doing or how we are doing it. Our work should honor him and should be a credit to his name. So let's just sum it up this way. Do not make a God of your work. Work for God. All we do is done as in his presence. It's under his domain. This should affect what you do and how you do it. Let's end, though, with what I hope will be an encouraging word. Note again in Exodus chapter 20, verses 5 and 6. These tell us the sort of God that we serve. Verse 5 reads, "Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them." Here's the sort of God we serve. "For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments." Now, in the Hebrew language, which is what these words originally were written in, numerals did not have a particular or specific designation. That is, they just gave the numeral, and from the context, you filled in what it is that that numeral referred to. Now, the context determines that, and it's really easy to figure it out. It's not difficult at all to know. So, for instance, it's verse 5. If you'll notice there, the translation has the word generation, third and fourth generation. And it may be that the word generation is in italics. What this is indicating is that the word is not found in the original Hebrew text, but it was added by the translators to give us a better understanding of the passage. And they did a good job, because that's exactly what is the meaning there. It seems evident that it's talking about the long-range effects, even to the third and fourth generation. So our caution is, don't underestimate the effects of our sin. But verse 6, this too is our God. Thousands of them, same thing. In the Hebrew text, it's referring to thousands. Thousands of what? Well, thousands of generations, that's the context. It's contrasted there with verse 5. So, showing mercy to thousands of generations that love God and keep his commandments. What this shows then is that the effects of our obedience and love for God has proportionally a greater relative effect than our sin. So don't underestimate the effects of sin. It has effect on us, it has effect on those around us, and it can have effect for generation upon generation upon generation upon generation. But we should not despair that our obedience is of lesser importance. In fact, could even eclipse by multitudes that which we have done wrong. So if we have failed in this, there is hope. If we're obeying, God says, I look upon that with great importance, and I will bless it abundantly. And this is true no matter what the job is or work that we're doing, as long as it is ethically moral sort of work. So that we understand that since our work is related to God, it reflects on him, and it's done for him, and it has this great blessing on it from God, our work takes on great significance. And God, according to this context, God says he considers it to be worship. So work becomes very significant because of the effects on our relationship to God and our relationship to our fellow man and the generations that follow. But not only is it significant, it's also sacred. We ought to treat it then with the respect and the honor that it's due. How do we do that? Well, we don't take it lightly. And we also take some time each week to consider what we did in that previous 6 days of work. We ask ourselves, has what I did in these previous weeks, has that been a benefit of service to my fellow man? And has it honored God? Has it brought glory to his name? Let's head back now to the website for our final song. But before that, this benediction. Now unto the King eternal, immortal, invisible, the only wise God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen.